I find questions like this frustrating because we have to change the punctuation, but also maybe the wording. And so it kind of gives us like two things to think about at once. But let's just look at the sentences and see what we've got here. Over 20 years ago, in a landmark experiment in the psychology of choice, Professor Sheena whatever set up a jam tasting booth at a grocery store. The number of jams available for tasting varied. Some shoppers had 24 different options, others only 6. Interestingly, the shoppers with fewer jams to choose from purchased more jam. Okay, so I read A just because I needed something to read. Mostly, we only need to think about the two sentences, or whatever you want to call them, that are kind of happening in the middle. Everything before and after is kind of extra, so we really just can kind of cut it off here and start here. We do need to think about sentence structure, though. The number of jams available for tasting varied. That would be a complete sentence, which is okay if we want to use the colon, because that's one of the requirements for the colon. We need to have a sentence beforehand. Afterward, we have some flexibility, but we do need a sentence beforehand. So let's look at what comes after, if we choose A or B. Some shoppers had 24 different options, others only 6. Well, that's also a sentence, right? We have a subject, some shoppers, and then a verb, had. So both those parts are sentences. And so the reason that that's a problem for choice B is that a comma by itself is not enough to connect two sentences. We need something else. We need a comma, maybe a conjunction, or maybe a word like while. Let's see. Now, D is definitely going to be wrong too, because if they are two sentences, again, we need some sort of punctuation to connect them. So now I'm looking at choice C. The number of jams available for tasting varied. While some shoppers had 24 different options, others only 6. Okay, so here's a problem of meaning. The word while is kind of a contrast word here. But the first part and the second part are not contrasting ideas. The number of jams available for tasting varied. Okay, and now they're going to explain how it varied, right? Some shoppers had 24, some only had 6, right? So that is just an explanation of the first piece. It is not a contrast to the first piece. So C is adding in a kind of an idea that shouldn't be present. So A is going to be correct because of two reasons. The grammar is good. Like I said, we need a sentence beforehand to have the colon be acceptable here, so that's okay. But afterwards, we have some flexibility. We could have a sentence, which is what's going on here, so we are allowed to have a second sentence. However, most of you think of colons involving lists, and actually sometimes it only has to be one word. So there's a lot of flexibility there, and the most important thing to remember for the SAT is that colons are not only for lists. Some lists get colons, some don't, and plenty of situations are acceptable for colons even that have nothing to do with lists. So that's kind of what's happening here, is there's no list here, but colon is perfectly valid. So grammatically, this works. Now stylistically, the colon is actually very, very useful because of how the first part and the second part relate to each other. We use a colon when we want the second part to kind of answer or explain something that's kind of uncertain or questionable about the first part. So in this case, it's set up like this. The number of jams available for tasting varied. It's kind of letting us ask, well, how? How did they vary? And then the second part is answering that question, explaining how they varied, right? That some shoppers had 24 different options, others only 6. So this is why colons are so useful, is they carry meaning with them. They actually let us do what we want to do here, which is explain the setup at the beginning. So unlike unlike choices C and D, where we have this contrast, choice A, even though there is no word, actually lets us continue a thought. That's the power of that colon. And so get used to that. That is much more important than things like lists. So that is absolutely going to be a valid solution to a lot of sentence connecting problems that you'll encounter on the test.